The first radar contact appeared at 3:47 hours, 37 miles southwest of the Alaskan coastline. NORAD controllers stared at their screens in disbelief as the signature materialized from electronic noise. A single aircraft, moving at impossible speeds through restricted airspace. The contact defied every protocol, every expectation, every law of physics they understood. Sword Base, we have an unidentified aircraft, bearing 270, altitude Angels 45, speed. Jesus Christ, speed is showing Mach 2.8 and climbing. Senior Airman Rodriguez leaned closer to his console, fingers dancing across holographic displays. Sir, the signature doesn't match anything in our database. Colonel Marcus Webb stepped behind Rodriguez's station, his weathered face illuminated by the ethereal blue glow of the tracking screen. 30 years of military service had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct screamed danger. The aircraft's flight path carved an erratic pattern across the digital map, too erratic for any known enemy fighter, too precise for mechanical failure. "Scramble the ready alert," Webb ordered, his voice cutting through the operations center's electronic hum. "Get me 2 Raptors airborne now." Within minutes, 2 F-22 stealth fighters roared from Elmendorf Air Force Base, their afterburners painting orange streaks against Alaska's perpetual twilight. Major Kyle "Phantom" Morrison led the intercept, his wingman Lieutenant Jake "Slider" Chen maintaining perfect formation 300 yards to starboard. Sword Base, Phantom 1-1 airborne. We have radar contact, bearing 265, distance 22 miles and closing. Morrison's voice remained steady despite his pulse quickening. 23 combat missions over 3 deployments had never prepared him for this moment. The unknown aircraft appeared on their targeting displays as a ghost, flickering between solid contact and electronic phantom. Morrison had intercepted Russian Bears, Chinese J-20s, even experimental drones, but this signature behaved like nothing in his experience. Phantom 1-1, you are cleared to close for visual identification. Rules of engagement are weapons tight unless fired upon. Webb's transmission carried the weight of potential international incident. Morrison's F-22 sliced through Arctic air at Mach 1.6, closing the distance with mechanical precision. His heads-up display painted targeting solutions across the canopy glass, but something felt wrong. The bogey's flight pattern wasn't aggressive, it was almost nostalgic. "Slider, you seeing this?" Morrison whispered into his oxygen mask. The unknown aircraft had begun executing a series of aerobatic maneuvers that defied conventional tactical doctrine. Barrel rolls transitioned into vertical climbs, followed by knife-edge passes that demonstrated impossible pilot skill. "Copy Phantom, that's not enemy behavior." Chen's radar warning receiver remained silent, no targeting locks, no aggressive posturing, just pure artistic flight. As Morrison closed to visual range, his breath caught in his throat. The aircraft before him wasn't enemy at all. It was American, but from another era entirely. Morrison's hands trembled slightly on the flight controls as the impossible sight resolved through his canopy. The aircraft ahead wasn't just American. It was a P-51 Mustang, its silver aluminum skin gleaming against Alaska's midnight sun like polished mercury. The fighter's distinctive profile was unmistakable. The scoop-nosed cowling, the laminar flow wing, the bubble canopy that had protected American pilots over European skis 8 decades earlier. But this was no museum piece. The Mustang moved with predatory grace, executing maneuvers that pushed the boundaries of what piston-engine aircraft could achieve. Morrison watched in stunned silence as the vintage fighter performed a Cuban 8 so precise it could have been drawn with a compass. "Sword Base, Phantom 1-1 has visual on bogey." Morrison's voice cracked slightly. Sir, it's a World War II P-51 Mustang. Confirm a P-51 Mustang." The silence from NORAD stretched for 17 seconds, an eternity in tactical radio protocol. Phantom 1-1, say again your last transmission. Webb's voice carried disbelief that matched Morrison's own. Sword base, bogey is definitely a North American P-51D Mustang, silver paint scheme, single occupant visible in cockpit. Morrison maneuvered his F-22 into loose formation, studying the impossible aircraft with Predator's eyes. Aircraft appears fully operational, no signs of distress. Chen's F-22 flanked the Mustang's starboard side, maintaining respectful distance. The vintage fighter's pilot seemed aware of their presence but showed no signs of alarm. Instead, the mysterious aviator executed a gentle wing rock, the universal aviation greeting. Morrison keyed his radio to the emergency frequency. Unknown aircraft, this is United States Air Force Phantom 1-1. You are in restricted airspace. Please identify yourself and state your intentions. Static filled the airwaves for 30 seconds before a voice emerged, clear, calm, and unmistakably female. The transmission quality was perfect, despite the Mustang's apparent age. Phantom 1-1, this is. The voice paused, as if the pilot were remembering something long forgotten. This is Valkyrie 77, requesting permission to continue current heading. Morrison exchanged glances with his own reflection in the canopy. Valkyrie 77 wasn't in any active call sign database. The designation belonged to another time, another war, another generation of pilots who had earned their wings when aviation was measured in courage rather than technology. Valkyrie 77, you are in violation of restricted airspace. Please comply with vectors to Elmendorf Air Force Base for immediate landing. The Mustang's response came not through radio, but through action. The vintage fighter began a climbing spiral that defied every performance chart Morrison had memorized during pilot training. The aircraft ascended through 45,000 feet, well beyond the operational ceiling of any propeller-driven aircraft, yet continued climbing with steady determination. Phantom 1-1, maintain visual contact but do not engage unless threatened. Webb's transmission carried new urgency. Intelligence analysts were already pulling historical records, searching for any reference to Valkyrie 77. Morrison pushed his F-22's throttles forward, following the impossible Mustang into thin air where jet engines belonged and piston engines should fail. His aircraft's sophisticated sensors recorded every detail: the perfect synchronization of the Mustang's propeller, the absence of any heat signature from its exhaust, the way sunlight seemed to bend around its silver skin. The formation continued climbing into Alaska's endless sky, two eras of American aviation locked in a dance that transcended time itself. In the depths of NORAD's classified archives, automated systems began pulling files that hadn't been accessed in 79 years. Buried beneath layers of digital security, a single document slowly materialized on Colonel Webb's secure terminal, a mission report dated September 15, 1944, signed by a pilot whose call sign was Valkyrie 77. The report's final entry was stamped with two words that made Webb's blood run cold: missing in action. But the pilot listed in that faded document was supposed to have been lost over the North Sea in 1944. Her aircraft never recovered, her fate unknown. Lieutenant Elena Valkyrie Marchetti had vanished during a long-range escort mission, becoming another casualty in the great ledger of wartime sacrifice. Webb stared at the photograph attached to Marchetti's service record. The young woman's eyes held a determination that transcended the sepia tones of military photography. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, but nothing could contain the fierce intelligence that blazed from her gaze. Phantom 1-1, Sword Base. We need you to maintain visual contact and attempt further communication. Do not, repeat, do not take any aggressive action. Morrison acknowledged the transmission while studying the Mustang with new respect. If the pilot was somehow connected to this historical ghost, then everything about this encounter shifted from tactical intercept to something approaching the supernatural. Valkyrie 77, this is Phantom 11. Can you confirm your aircraft type and current mission status? The response came with crystalline clarity, as if the decades between 1944 and 2025 were merely static on an old radio. Phantom 11, I'm flying a P-51D Mustang, tail number 4073877. My mission is... Another pause, longer this time. My mission was to escort B-17s to the target zone, but I seem to have gotten a bit off course. Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with altitude. Aircraft 4073877 was listed in military records as destroyed over hostile territory on September 15, 1944. The bomber formation Elena Marchetti had been escorting never reached their target that day. They were intercepted by German fighters and scattered across the European sky. Valkyrie 77, what is your current location? Well, Phantom, that's a good question. The female pilot's voice carried a note of confusion mixed with growing awareness. Last I remember, I was over the North Sea, chasing down a Messerschmitt that had broken through our formation. Then everything went white, and now... She paused, and Morrison could imagine her looking around at the impossible landscape below. Now I'm seeing mountains and ice where there should be ocean. The Mustang began a gentle descent, its pilot apparently processing information that defied rational explanation. Morrison matched the vintage fighter's flight path, maintaining formation with an aircraft that had no business existing in 2025. Phantom 11, Sword Base. Historical analysis confirms Valkyrie 77 went missing September 1944. Pilot was Lieutenant Elena Marchetti, age 23, veteran of 37 combat missions. Morrison absorbed this intelligence briefing while watching the impossible made manifest. The woman flying formation beside him had been born in 1921, had learned to fly before television was common, had fought a war that ended before his grandparents were married. Valkyrie 77, can you tell me what year you believe it to be? The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Elena's voice returned, smaller now, touched with the first hint of uncertainty. Phantom 11, my last mission log shows September 15, 1944, but something's not right. The sky looks different. The stars are wrong. Her voice strengthened with pilot's pragmatism. And your aircraft? What type of fighter are you flying? I've never seen anything like it. Morrison looked at his sleek F-22 Raptor, its angular stealth geometry, a testament to 8 decades of aviation evolution. How could he explain fly-by-wire controls to someone who learned on stick and rudder? How could he describe thrust vectoring to a pilot whose fighter relied on a supercharged Merlin engine? Valkyrie 77, I'm flying an F-22 Raptor. It's a newer design. Elena's laugh carried across the radio waves, warm, genuine, tinged with the gallows humor that all combat pilots shared regardless of their era. Newer than 1944, I'm guessing. Well, Phantom, this is either the strangest dream I've ever had, or the war has changed considerably while I was away. As the two aircraft descended through 30,000 feet, Morrison realized he was witnessing something beyond military protocol, beyond standard operating procedures. He was flying formation with a legend returned, a ghost given wings, a warrior whose time had somehow found its way home. The formation descended through layers of cloud that seemed to part for Elena's passage, revealing Alaska's pristine wilderness below. Morrison found himself studying the Mustang with new appreciation, noting details that spoke of a different era of aviation. The aircraft bore the scars of combat, patched bullet holes, faded squadron markings, the subtle asymmetries that marked a fighter maintained by ground crews working with battlefield improvisation rather than factory precision. Valkyrie 77, can you describe your last memory before arriving here? Alina's voice carried the measured tone of a mission debrief, professional despite impossible circumstances. I had engaged a German fighter that broke through our bomber formation. Single-engine Messerschmitt, probably a 109. We were locked in a vertical climb over the North Sea when everything went bright, brighter than the sun, brighter than anything I'd ever seen. Morrison exchanged glances with Chen, who was maintaining silent formation off the Mustang's starboard wing. The scenario defied every rational explanation, yet here they were, three American pilots separated by 8 decades, yet united in the brotherhood of flight. After the light faded, Alina continued, I found myself here, with mountains where there should be ocean and aircraft beside me that look like they belong in a science fiction magazine. She paused, and Morrison could hear the smile in her voice. Though I have to admit they're beautiful machines. Clean lines, no visible propeller. Are those jet engines? Affirmative, Valkyrie 77. Twin Pratt & Whitney F-119 turbofans. Turbofans, Alina repeated, testing the unfamiliar word. The future certainly sounds complicated. Morrison made a decision that went against 70 years of Cold War conditioning. Valkyrie 77, would you like me to show you what they can do? I thought you'd never ask, Phantom. What followed was an impromptu air show 30,000 feet above the Alaskan wilderness. Morrison demonstrated the F-22s' thrust vectoring capabilities, executing post-stall maneuvers that seemed to suspend his aircraft in defiance of physics. The Raptor rotated around its center of gravity, pointing its nose skyward while maintaining forward motion, then transitioning into a controlled flat spin that no conventional aircraft could survive. Alina responded with demonstrations of her own, classic World War II fighter tactics executed with precision that belonged in aviation textbooks. Her Mustang danced through vertical reversals and split-S maneuvers, showing Morrison that raw pilot skill could make any machine lethal in the right hands. Not bad for government work, Alina transmitted, her Mustang settling into formation beside Morrison's F-22. Though I notice your aircraft doesn't seem to have any visible weapons. Morrison smiled behind his oxygen mask. Their internal, Valkyrie 77, stealth configuration. Stealth, Alina pondered this concept. Invisible to enemy radar, I'm guessing. Something like that. Well, that would have been handy over Berlin. Her tone carried the weight of battles fought when stealth meant flying low and hopping the flak gunners missed. How many sorties have you flown, Phantom? 23 combat missions, ma'am. Ma'am? Alina's laugh carried genuine amusement. Phantom, I may be old enough to be your great-grandmother by now, but in this cockpit we're equals. Call me Valkyrie. Morrison felt something shift in that moment, a recognition that transcended rank, era, and the impossible circumstances of their meeting. They were pilots, warriors who had chosen to risk everything in defense of ideals larger than themselves. The decades between them dissolved like morning mist. Copy that, Valkyrie. 23 missions. How many did you fly? 37 confirmed, plus today makes 38. Alina's voice carried quiet pride, though I suspect today's going to be a bit different from the others. The radio crackled as Colonel Webb's voice cut through their aerial conversation. Phantom 1-1, Sword Base. We need both aircraft to vector to Elmendorf for immediate landing. Weather is closing in from the south and we have complications. Morrison checked his fuel gauge, sufficient for another 90 minutes of flight. Chen's aircraft showed similar status, but weather in Alaska could transition from clear skies to whiteout conditions in minutes, and landing a supernatural P-51 Mustang would require careful planning. Sword Base, Phantom 1-1 copies. Valkyrie 77, are you prepared to follow us to a military airfield? Alina's response came without hesitation. Lead the way, Phantom, though I should warn you, I'm not entirely sure my aircraft will behave normally once we're on the ground. Morrison didn't ask what she meant by that. Some questions were better left unanswered until absolutely necessary. The formation turned southeast toward Elmendorf Air Force Base, 3 American fighters from 2 different wars flying through Alaska's endless sky. Behind them, storm clouds gathered with ominous purpose, as if nature itself was responding to the temporal disruption their flight represented. As they approached the airbase, Morrison could see emergency vehicles lining the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, and several unmarked black SUVs that suggested government interest extended far beyond routine aircraft intercepts. Alina's voice cut through the preparation static. "Phantom, whatever happens when we land, I want you to know, it's been an honor flying with you." Morrison felt a tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with altitude or oxygen systems. "The honor is mine, Valkyrie. It's been the privilege of a lifetime." The formation began its approach to Elmendorf Air Force Base as Alaska's weather closed in behind them, carrying secrets that would challenge everything the military understood about time, space, and the bonds that unite warriors across generations. Elmendorf's approach control vectored the unusual formation toward runway 5, their voices professionally calm despite the circumstances. Morrison could imagine the controlled chaos in the tower, controllers managing an intercept that had become something unprecedented in aviation history. Phantom flight, cleared for landing runway 05, wind 080 at 15, visibility 10 miles, ceiling 2500 broken. The controller's voice carried practiced neutrality, but Morrison detected underlying tension. Landing a World War II fighter required different considerations than modern jet aircraft. Valkyrie 77, are you familiar with current landing procedures? Alina's response came with the confidence of a pilot who had landed on everything from grass strips in England to hastily constructed airfields in liberated France. "Phantom, I've put this bird down on cow pastures and aircraft carriers. I think I can handle your runway." As the formation descended through 1,500 feet, Morrison noted something troubling. Alina's P-51 was beginning to shimmer slightly, its solid form flickering like heat distortion on summer asphalt. The phenomenon was subtle but unmistakable through his high-resolution heads-up display. "Sword Base Phantom 11, I'm seeing some kind of visual distortion around Valkyrie 77's aircraft. Please advise." Colonel Webb's response was immediate. "Phantom 11, maintain formation and continue approach. All emergency services are standing by." The Mustang's landing gear extended with mechanical precision, 2 main wheels and a tail wheel that spoke to an era when pilots landed with stick and rudder rather than computer assistance. Alina configured her aircraft for landing with smooth efficiency, demonstrating skills that bridged 8 decades of aviation evolution. Valkyrie 77, you're cleared to land. Emergency equipment is standing by as a precautionary measure. Copy Phantom, though I should mention I'm not sure how long this aircraft will remain substantial once we're on the ground. Morrison felt a chill of understanding. Alina wasn't just flying a vintage fighter. She was somehow maintaining its existence through will, skill, and whatever force had brought her forward through time. Landing might break whatever supernatural mechanism kept her P-51 manifested in 2025. Valkyrie, if your aircraft becomes unstable after landing, are you prepared for emergency egress? Phantom, I've been preparing for emergency egress my entire military career. Alina's voice carried the dry humor of a combat veteran. Though I admit, this situation wasn't covered in flight school. The formation touched down in perfect sequence. Chen's F-22 first, followed by Morrison's Raptor, with Alina's Mustang settling onto the runway with the gentle precision of a bird returning to its nest. For a moment, All three aircraft rolled down the concrete in formation, past and future united in the fundamental act of aviation. But as Alina's P-51 slowed to taxi speed, the shimmering intensified. The Mustang's silver skin began to fade, becoming translucent against Alaska's concrete reality. Morrison watched in fascination and growing alarm as the impossible aircraft started dissolving back into whatever realm had preserved it for 8 decades. Phantom 11, get your pilot clear of that aircraft now. Webb's voice cut through radio protocol with raw urgency. Alina's canopy was already sliding back as she prepared to abandon the dissolving fighter. But her voice remained calm, professional, touched with the acceptance that all combat pilots carried like a survival tool. Phantom, it's been the flight of a lifetime. Take care of yourselves up there. As emergency crews surrounded the fatting Mustang, Morrison realized he was witnessing the end of something magnificent, a warrior's return to whatever peace awaited those who had given everything in service of freedom. Alina Marchetti stepped from her dissolving P-51 Mustang with the same calm professionalism she had demonstrated throughout their impossible flight. Her leather flight jacket and silk scarf seemed solid enough, but Morrison noticed the same translucent quality beginning to affect her physical form. Whatever force had brought her forward through time was weakening with each passing moment. Emergency crews approached cautiously, their training inadequate for situations involving temporal displacement and supernatural aviation. Alina walked toward them with steady steps, removing her leather flight helmet to reveal dark hair streaked with silver, the only visible sign of her 8-decade journey through time. "Gentlemen," she addressed the approaching technicians with a smile that carried both warmth and infinite sadness, "I believe you'll find my aircraft is no longer in need of your services." Behind her, the P-51 Mustang completed its transition from solid matter to memory. The last visible element was its propeller, spinning slowly in Alaska's midnight sun before fading like morning mist. Where one of aviation's most celebrated fighters had sat moments before, only empty concrete remained. Colonel Webb emerged from a black SUV, his weathered face struggling to process what he was witnessing. 30 years of military service had prepared him for many scenarios, but briefing a time-displaced World War II pilot wasn't covered in any manual. "Lieutenant Marchetti," Webb began formally, "on behalf of the United States Air Force, welcome to 2025. Alina's laugh was genuine, touched with wonder and growing understanding. "Colonel, I have to ask, did we win?" "Ma'am." "The war, Colonel. Did we win the war?" Webb's expression softened with something approaching reverence. "Yes, ma'am, we won. Germany surrendered May 8, 1945. Japan surrendered September 2, same year. The war you were fighting, we won." Alina closed her eyes for a moment, and Morrison saw tears track down her cheeks. When she opened them again, her gaze held profound relief mixed with infinite weariness. "Good," she whispered. "That's good. The boys who didn't make it home, they need to know it wasn't for nothing." "It wasn't for nothing," Morrison found himself saying. "Everything we have, everything we are, we built it on the foundation you and your generation laid down." Alina turned toward Morrison, her form becoming more translucent with each passing minute. "And what about you, Phantom? What wars are you fighting now?" Morrison struggled to find words that could encompass the complexity of 21st-century conflict. How could he explain asymmetric warfare, cyber threats, and global terrorism to someone whose war had clear enemies and defined battle lines? Different wars, Valkyrie. Smaller conflicts, but they still matter. We still need pilots willing to stand between freedom and those who would destroy it. Alina nodded with understanding that transcended eras. The enemy changes, but the mission remains the same. She looked up at Alaska's vast sky, where Chen's F-22 was executing a missing man formation, a single aircraft where 3 had flown together. "Your aircraft are impressive, Phantom, But the pilots are just like us. I can see it in your eyes. What do you see? The willingness to go when others stay, the acceptance that some things are worth dying for. Alina's smile held 8 decades of wisdom. Tell me about your squadron, Phantom. Do you have good wingmen? Morrison glanced toward Chen, who was maintaining respectful distance while monitoring the supernatural proceedings. The best, Valkyrie. We take care of each other. That's all that matters. Aircraft and weapons and technology, those are just tools. But pilots who trust each other, who'll follow each other into hell and back. That's what wins wars. Colonel Webb stepped forward as Alina's form became increasingly ethereal. Lieutenant Marchetti, we have teams standing by to debrief you, to learn everything we can about your experience. Alina shook her head gently. Colonel, I don't think there's time for debriefings. Whatever brought me here is calling me home. She looked directly at Morrison. But Phantom, I need you to promise me something. Anything, Valkyrie? Remember this flight. Remember that courage isn't about the technology you're flying. It's about the willingness to climb into that cockpit when the mission calls. And remember that warriors from every era share the same sky. As Alina Marchetti began to fade like sunset into memory, Morrison felt something profound shift within his understanding of duty, honor, and the continuum of service that connected all those who had chosen the warrior's path. Alina's form was now barely visible against Alaska's eternal landscape, but her voice remained clear and strong, the voice of every pilot who had ever pushed beyond the edge of the possible in service of something greater than themselves. Phantom, she said, her words carrying across the years like radio waves through the night. There's something else. Something I learned during my 37 missions. Something every combat pilot discovers if they live long enough. Morrison leaned forward, desperate to capture whatever wisdom this legendary aviator might share before time reclaimed her completely. The real enemy isn't the aircraft you're fighting, it's fear. Fear of failure, fear of letting down your wingmen, fear of not being good enough when the moment comes. But here's the secret they don't teach in flight school. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is flying the mission despite the fear. Alina turned toward Chen's distant F-22, still maintaining its lonely vigil in Alaska's sky. Your wingman up there, he's afraid too. Afraid of losing you, afraid of making the wrong decision when everything depends on split-second timing. But he's still up there, isn't he? Yes, ma'am. Then he understands what it means to be a warrior, and so do you. Alina's smile carried the warmth of every mentor who had ever guided a young pilot through the challenges of military aviation. The aircraft change, the weapons evolve, the threats shift with each generation. But the heart of a fighter pilot that stays constant. Colonel Webb approached with obvious reluctance, his expression mixing professional duty with human compassion. Lieutenant Marchetti, we have historians, military analysts, people who need to understand how this is possible. Alina's laugh was gentle but firm. Colonel, some mysteries aren't meant to be solved by committees and classified reports. Sometimes the important thing isn't how something happens, it's what we learn from the fact that it happened at all. She looked around at the assembled personnel, pilots, ground crews, intelligence officers, all watching history dissolve back into legend before their eyes. What happened today proves something important. The bonds between warriors transcend time, space, and even death itself. When the mission calls, we answer. When freedom needs defending, we climb into our cockpits and point our aircraft toward the threat. Alina's form had become so translucent that Morrison could see the runway lights through her fatting silhouette. But her presence remained strong, her words carrying the accumulated wisdom of 37 combat missions and 8 decades of waiting. Phantom, promise me something else. Name it, Valkyrie. The next time you're flying formation with someone who doubts themselves, someone who thinks they don't have what it takes to be a real fighter pilot, remember today. Remember that courage comes in all forms, from all eras, and that sometimes the most unexpected people become the heroes the mission needs. Morrison felt tears forming behind his oxygen mask, though they had landed 20 minutes ago. "I promise, Valkyrie, I'll remember." "Good." Alina began walking toward her dissolving aircraft, each step taking her further from 2025 and closer to whatever realm awaited completed missions and honored dead. "And Phantom, the formation signal you recognized earlier, the arc pattern that made you hold fire." "Yes, ma'am." "That wasn't random. That was victory formation, something we developed during the war for pilots returning from successful missions. Your instinct to recognize it, to understand what it meant. That's the continuity of military aviation. That's proof that some knowledge passes from pilot to pilot across generations, even when we don't understand how." As Alina reached the spot where her P-51 Mustang had finally dissolved, she turned back toward Morrison one final time. Her form was now more memory than substance, held together by will and the fundamental truth that some bonds transcend physical reality. "Take care of the sky, Phantom. Keep it free." And with those words, Alina Marchetti faded completely, leaving only the Alaskan wind and the memory of what Morrison would later describe as the most important flight of his career. The silence that followed Alina's departure was profound, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something larger than words. Colonel Webb, Morrison, Chen, and the assembled ground crews stood on the empty runway, each processing the impossible experience in their own way. Morrison found himself staring at the exact spot where Alina's P-51 Mustang had dissolved, half expecting to see some residual evidence of its presence. But the concrete showed nothing unusual. No scorch marks, no oil stains, no indication that one of history's most celebrated fighters had occupied that space just minutes before. Chen's F-22 settled onto the runway with a whisper of rubber on concrete, its pilot eager to rejoin his wingman after the strangest intercept mission in Air Force history. As Chen taxied toward the group, Morrison realized that their encounter with Alina Marchetti would become the kind of story that military aviators shared in quiet moments, passed down through generations of fighter pilots like oral tradition. "Phantom 11, how do you want to file this report?" Colonel Webb's question carried layers of complexity that extended far beyond standard military paperwork. Morrison considered the options. How do you document a temporal displacement? How do you classify an encounter that defied every known law of physics? How do you honor the memory of a pilot who had somehow transcended death itself to deliver a message about the continuity of military service? "Sir, I recommend we file it exactly as it happened. Unknown aircraft intercept, visual identification of historical P-51 Mustang, peaceful contact with pilot claiming to be Lieutenant Alina Marchetti, missing in action September 1944. Let the analysts make sense of the details." Webb nodded slowly, and the fact that both aircraft and pilot disappeared after landing. "Equipment malfunction during documentation, sir. Sometimes the most important truths can't be captured on film or recorded by instruments." Chen approached the group, removing his helmet to reveal a face marked by wonder and growing understanding. "Major Morrison, I monitored the entire encounter from altitude. Whatever just happened here, it felt like more than a simple intercept." "What did it feel like, Lieutenant?" Chen struggled for words that could encompass the experience. "It felt like receiving a message from every pilot who came before us. Like Alina Marchetti wasn't just representing herself, but speaking for everyone who ever strapped on wings in defense of freedom." Morrison realized Chen had grasped something profound about their encounter, something that extended beyond the supernatural circumstances to touch the fundamental nature of military service itself. "Colonel Webb," Morrison said, making a decision that would influence his entire subsequent career, I request permission to research Lieutenant Alina Marchetti's complete service record. If she somehow returned to deliver a message, we owe it to her memory to understand what that message was. Granted, I'll have the historical archives open to your research. Webb paused, studying Morrison's face with the assessment skills of a senior officer. Major, this encounter has affected you profoundly. How do you think it will change your approach to military aviation? Morrison looked up at Alaska's vast sky, where the aurora borealis was beginning its nightly dance across the heavens. The same sky Alina had flown through, the same stars that had guided her navigation during those 37 combat missions over Europe. Sir, I think it's going to remind me that every time I climb into that cockpit, I'm continuing a conversation that started with the Wright brothers and will continue long after I'm gone. Alina Marchetti proved that the bonds between military aviators transcend time itself. And what does that mean for how you'll approach future missions? Morrison felt Alina's presence like an invisible wingman, her wisdom becoming part of his own understanding of what it meant to be a fighter pilot. It means I'll remember that courage isn't about individual heroics. It's about maintaining faith with everyone who wore these wings before us, and everyone who will wear them after we're gone. Colonel Webb smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Major Morrison, I think you've learned something today that they can't teach in any flight school. As the assembled personnel began dispersing, returning to the routine business of defending American airspace, Morrison remained on the runway for several more minutes. The spot where Alina's aircraft had dissolved seemed to pulse with residual energy, as if the boundary between past and present remained thin in that particular location. Chen joined him in the vigil, both pilots sharing the comfortable silence that exists between warriors who have witnessed something beyond ordinary experience. You know what the strangest part was, Chen said eventually. What's that? She seemed more real than most people I've met, more present, more substantial, like she was exactly where she belonged. Morrison nodded, understanding completely. Alina Marchetti had carried herself with the confidence of someone whose purpose was crystal clear, whose mission was fundamental to her identity. She had been a pilot in the truest sense, someone whose entire being was oriented toward flight, toward service, toward the defense of ideals larger than personal survival. Chen, I think she was exactly where she belonged, and I think we were supposed to be here to meet her. You think this was planned somehow? Morrison looked up at the aurora-painted sky, considering forces beyond military understanding. I think there are aspects of military service that connect us across time and space in ways we don't fully comprehend. Alina needed to deliver her message, and we needed to receive it. What was her message? Morrison smiled, Alina's wisdom settling into his consciousness like muscle memory. That the mission continues, that every generation of warriors builds on the foundation laid by those who came before, and that courage is a choice we make every time we strap on wings and point our aircraft toward the unknown. As Morrison and Chen finally walked toward the operations building, neither pilot looked back at the empty runway. Some experiences were too profound to be diminished by second-guessing or excessive analysis. They had been chosen as witnesses to something that transcended standard military protocol, and both understood the responsibility that came with such privilege. 3 weeks later, Morrison sat in the base library, surrounded by declassified documents that painted a picture of Alina Marchetti's remarkable military career. The young woman who had somehow transcended death to deliver her message had been far more than a typical World War II pilot. Alina's service record revealed a pattern of extraordinary performance under impossible conditions. She had volunteered for the most dangerous missions, consistently bringing damaged aircraft home when others might have bailated out over enemy territory. Her squadron mates had nicknamed her Valkyrie, not just for her call sign, but for her uncanny ability to appear when other pilots needed rescue. The mission reports were particularly illuminating. Alina had been credited with saving 17 Allied airmen during her 37 combat sorties, diving into dogfights to extract pilots under attack, escorting damaged bombers through flak-filled skis, even landing on enemy airfields to retrieve downed aviators. Her P-51 Mustang had become legendary among the bomber crews she protected. But it was her final mission report that made Morrison's hands tremble as he read. On September 15, 1944, Alina had been escorting a formation of B-17 flying fortresses to their target when German fighters intercepted the group. According to the surviving crew members' testimonies, Alina had engaged multiple enemy aircraft simultaneously, drawing them away from the vulnerable bombers. The last anyone saw of her was a single P-51 Mustang climbing vertically into a cloud bank, pursued by 3 Messerschmitt fighters. Radio contact was lost at 13:47 hours. Neither Alina nor her aircraft was ever recovered, despite extensive search operations. The bombers completed their mission, Morrison read aloud from the faded report. All aircraft returned safely to base. Lieutenant Marchetti's sacrifice saved 21 crew members and ensured mission success. Morrison leaned back in his chair, understanding dawning like sunrise over mountains. Alina hadn't simply been transported through time for a casual encounter with modern military aviation. She had been completing her mission, the same mission she had died for in 1944. The formation signal she had flown over Alaska, the victory formation that had prevented Morrison from engaging, wasn't random. It was Alina's way of demonstrating that her final mission had been successful, that the bombers she died protecting had reached their target and returned home safely. "She came back to show us the victory," Morrison whispered to the empty library. "She came back to prove that sacrifice has meaning, that missions completed echo across generations." Morrison's research expanded beyond Alina's individual service record to encompass the broader context of women in military aviation during World War II. He discovered that female pilots like Alina had faced extraordinary challenges, proving their competence in a male-dominated field, while simultaneously fighting a global war that demanded everything they could give. The Women Air Force Service Pilots program had been classified for decades after the war ended. Alina and her fellow aviators had served without military recognition, without benefits, without official acknowledgement of their contributions to Allied victory. They had flown because the mission demanded pilots, and they had been willing to answer that call regardless of official recognition. 38 women died serving as military pilots during World War II, Morrison read from a declassified Pentagon report. Their families received no death benefits, no military honors, no flag-draped coffins. They were classified as civilian contractors, despite flying military aircraft in combat zones. The injustice of this classification burned in Morrison's chest. Alina Marchetti had died protecting Allied bombers from enemy fighters, a combat mission by any reasonable definition. Yet her sacrifice had been minimized by bureaucratic categories that failed to capture the reality of her service. Morrison made another decision that would define his post-military career. He began documenting not just Alina's story, but the stories of all 38 women who had died as military pilots during World War II. Their names, their missions, their final moments, all of it deserved preservation, recognition, and honor. Chen joined Morrison's research efforts, bringing technical expertise and fresh perspective to the historical investigation. Together, they uncovered patterns that revealed the true scope of female military aviation during the war years. "Look at this," Chen said, spreading photographs across the library table. These women weren't just flying cargo planes and ferry missions. They were test pilots, combat pilots, instructors for male aviators who would later fly in combat. Alina Marchetti was part of a generation of female pilots who proved women could handle anything military aviation demanded. Morrison studied the photographs, young women standing beside fighters and bombers that represented the cutting edge of 1940s technology. Their expressions held the same confident determination Morrison had seen in Alina's eyes during their impossible encounter. Chen, I think Alina's message was bigger than just individual courage. I think she was representing all of these women, all of the female military aviators whose contributions were minimized or forgotten after the war ended. What are you thinking? Morrison felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, the same weight Alina had carried during her 37 combat missions. I'm thinking we need to make sure their stories survive. We need to ensure that future generations of military pilots understand the complete history of aviation, not just the parts that fit comfortable narratives. Their research revealed that Alina's squadron had recommended her for the Distinguished Flying Cross after her disappearance, citing her 37 successful missions and the 17 Allied airmen she had saved through extraordinary valor. The recommendation had been denied by higher authorities, who claimed that civilian contractors were ineligible for military decorations. Civilian contractors, Chen said bitterly. She died fighting enemy aircraft to protect Allied bombers, and they called her a civilian contractor. Morrison felt Alina's presence like a gentle hand on his shoulder, her wisdom guiding his understanding toward broader truths about military service and the recognition it deserved. Chen, I don't think Alina came back for medals or official recognition. I think she came back to remind us that the mission is bigger than individual glory. Then what did she come back for? Morrison looked up from the historical documents toward the window, where F-22 Raptors were conducting training flights in Alaska's endless sky. Modern military aviation, built on the foundation that Alina and her generation had established through sacrifice and determination. She came back to ensure continuity, to prove that the bonds between military aviators transcend time, gender, recognition, and even death itself. She came back to remind us that when we climb into our cockpits, we're continuing a conversation that includes every pilot who ever wore wings in service of something greater than themselves. Morrison's research culminated in a comprehensive report that he submitted through proper military channels, detailing Alina Marchetti's service record and recommending posthumous recognition for her contributions to Allied victory during World War II. The report included technical analysis of their encounter, witness statements from multiple personnel, and historical documentation that supported Alina's claims about her military service. The response came 6 weeks later, a letter from the Pentagon acknowledging Morrison's research while politely declining to pursue posthumous awards for World War II civilian contractors. The letter thanked Morrison for his interesting historical documentation, while making it clear that military bureaucracy remained unchanged by supernatural encounters. Morrison read the rejection letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in Alina's service file. Some battles couldn't be won through official channels, but that didn't diminish their importance or the need to fight them. Chen found Morrison in the squadron ready room later that afternoon, staring out the window at aircraft that represented 8 decades of aviation evolution since Alina's final mission. The Pentagon turned down the posthumous award recommendation, Morrison said, without looking away from the flight line. I figured they would. Bureaucracy doesn't adapt quickly to supernatural evidence. Chen settled into the chair beside Morrison's desk, but that doesn't mean Alina's mission failed. How do you figure? Chen pointed toward a group of young pilots preparing for their evening training sortie, men and women from diverse backgrounds, united by their commitment to military aviation and the defense of freedom. Look at them. Every one of those pilots carries Alina's legacy forward every time they strap on wings. Her mission was never about getting official recognition. Morrison realized Chen was right. Alina had returned not to change Pentagon policy, but to ensure that her example would inspire future generations of military aviators. Her message about courage, continuity, and the bonds between warriors had already been received by the people who mattered most, the pilots who would carry those values forward. "What do we do with everything we've learned?" Morrison asked. Chen smiled, his expression carrying Alina's determination translated into modern context. "We remember. We tell her story to every young pilot who needs to understand that courage comes in all forms. We ensure that future generations know the complete history of military aviation, including the contributions of people like Alina Marchetti." Morrison nodded, understanding that their encounter with Alina had been a beginning rather than an ending. She had entrusted them with preserving the memory of her generation's sacrifice, and that responsibility would guide their actions for the rest of their military careers. That evening, Morrison stood on the same runway where Alina's P-51 Mustang had dissolved 3 weeks earlier. The concrete showed no trace of her presence, but her influence on his understanding of military service would last for the remainder of his life. Above him, the aurora borealis painted shifting patterns across Alaska's night sky, the same stars that had guided Alina's navigation during 37 combat missions over Europe. The continuity between past and present felt tangible in the Arctic air, connecting all who had ever looked up at those stars while preparing for missions that would test their courage and commitment. Morrison keyed his radio to the frequency Alina had used during their impossible flight together. Static filled the airwaves for several minutes before he spoke into the darkness. "Valkyrie 77, this is Phantom 11. Your message has been received and understood. The mission continues." The static continued for 30 seconds before fading into silence. But Morrison felt Alina's acknowledgement in the way the aurora shifted overhead, painting new patterns that seemed to incorporate both past and future into a single, magnificent display. 2 years after his encounter with Alina Marchetti, Major Kyle Morrison received orders that would define the next phase of his military career. He was selected to command a new squadron specifically tasked with training the Air Force's next generation of fighter pilots, young aviators who would carry military aviation into an uncertain future. Morrison's first official act as squadron commander was to establish the Valkyrie Flight Training Program, an intensive course that combined advanced tactical instruction with comprehensive historical education. Every pilot who completed the program would learn not just how to fly modern fighters, but why their service connected them to warriors across generations. The program's curriculum included detailed study of World War II aviation, with special emphasis on the contributions of female military pilots, whose service had been overlooked by traditional military history. Alina Marchetti's story became a cornerstone of the program, demonstrating how individual courage could influence events across decades. "Today you're going to learn about a pilot who proved that the bonds between warriors transcend time itself," Morrison announced to his first class of trainee pilots. 24 young aviators, 12 men and 12 women, listened with the intensity that marked all who had chosen the fighter pilot path. Morrison displayed Alina's photograph on the briefing room screen, her 1944 portrait showing the determination that had carried her through 37 combat missions. Lieutenant Alina Marchetti, call sign Valkyrie 77, disappeared over the North Sea in September 1944 while protecting Allied bombers from enemy fighters. He paused, studying the faces of his students. These young pilots would inherit responsibility for defending American airspace using technology Alina could never have imagined, but they would face the same fundamental challenges she had confronted: fear, uncertainty, and the weight of making life-or-death decisions under impossible pressure. Alina's final mission saved 21 Allied crew members and ensured that her bomber formation reached its target successfully. She died alone, far from home, with no guarantee that her sacrifice would be remembered or honored. Morrison's voice carried Alina's strength, her example guiding his words. But her mission didn't end with her death. Morrison described his encounter with Alina over Alaska, presenting it as a learning exercise in the continuity of military service, rather than focusing on its supernatural aspects. The young pilots absorbed every detail, understanding instinctively that they were receiving wisdom that transcended ordinary flight training. What Alina taught me, what she taught all of us who witnessed her return, is that military service creates bonds that exist outside normal limitations. When you strap on wings in defense of freedom, you join a conversation that includes every pilot who ever faced enemy fire with nothing but skill, courage, and commitment to mission success. Lieutenant Sarah Phoenix Rodriguez raised her hand, her expression thoughtful. "Sir, what was the most important thing Alina wanted us to understand?" Morrison smiled, Alina's presence like an invisible co-pilot guiding his response. "That courage isn't about individual heroics, Phoenix. Courage is about maintaining faith with everyone who wore these wings before us, and everyone who will wear them after we're gone. It's about understanding that when you climb into your cockpit, you're continuing a mission that started before you were born and will continue long after you're gone." The training program Morrison established became legendary within Air Force circles, producing pilots who demonstrated exceptional skill, judgment, and understanding of military aviation's broader purpose. Graduates of the Valkyrie program were known for their technical competence and their deep appreciation for the historical continuum they represented. Chen, now promoted to major, served as Morrison's deputy commander, bringing his own insights about the encounter with Alina to bear on pilot training. Together, they created an educational environment that honored the past while preparing aviators for future challenges. "The thing about Alina," Chen told each new class during their historical briefing, "is that she proved excellence in military aviation isn't about the technology you're flying, it's about the character you bring to the mission." Her P-51 Mustang was advanced for 1944, but it was primitive compared to what you'll be flying. The difference between success and failure was Alina herself. Morrison's program attracted attention from military leadership, who recognized that his approach to pilot training was producing exceptional results. Young aviators who completed the Valkyrie program demonstrated lower accident rates, better decision-making under pressure, and stronger cohesion as squadron members. The Pentagon commissioned a study of Morrison's training methods, seeking to understand why his graduates outperformed pilots from conventional programs. The resulting report identified several factors, but Morrison knew the real reason for their success couldn't be captured in statistical analysis. His pilots succeeded because they understood they were part of something larger than themselves. Alina's example had taught them that individual missions contributed to a broader campaign that spanned generations, and that knowledge gave their service deeper meaning than mere professional competence. 3 years into the program, Morrison received a letter that changed everything. It came from Elizabeth Marchetti Williams, Alina's grandniece, who had been researching her family's military history and discovered references to her great-aunt's supernatural encounter over Alaska. "Major Morrison," the letter began, "I hope you'll forgive my writing to you directly, but I believe you may be the only person who can help me understand what happened to my great-aunt Alina during the war." Elizabeth explained that Alina had never married, had no direct descendants, but had been remembered fondly by family members who preserved her letters, photographs, and personal effects. The family had always believed Alina died in combat over Europe, but Elizabeth's research had uncovered references to her appearance over Alaska in 2025. "I know this sounds impossible," Elizabeth wrote, but I have documents that suggest Alina somehow returned after her death to complete some kind of final mission. If you're the Major Morrison mentioned in the classified reports I've been able to access, I would be honored to meet with you and learn more about my great aunt's legacy." Morrison read the letter 3 times, understanding that Alina's influence was continuing to expand beyond his own experience. Her grandniece represented another generation seeking connection with the warrior tradition Alina had embodied. Morrison invited Elizabeth to visit the base, where she could see the Valkyrie flight training program and understand how Alina's example was shaping modern military aviation. The meeting that followed would prove that Alina's mission truly transcended the boundaries of life and death. Elizabeth Marchetti Williams arrived at Elmendorf Air Force Base on a crisp October morning, carrying a leather satchel that contained 8 decades of preserved family memories. Morrison met her at the base entrance, immediately recognizing Alina's fierce intelligence in her grandniece's eyes. "Major Morrison," Elizabeth said, extending her hand with the confident manner that marked all the women in Alina's family line. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know my request must have seemed unusual." Morrison guided Elizabeth toward the operations building where Alina's story had become part of official squadron history. "Ms. Williams, your great-aunt changed my understanding of what it means to be a military pilot. Any family member of Alina Marchetti is welcome here." Elizabeth opened her satchel as they walked, revealing photographs, letters, and personal effects that painted a picture of Alina's life beyond her military service. The young woman who had volunteered for dangerous missions had also been a daughter, sister, and beloved family member whose loss had echoed through generations. "Alina wrote constantly during her deployment," Elizabeth explained, showing Morrison a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. "She told our family about her missions, her squadron mates, her aircraft, but she also wrote about her dreams for after the war." Morrison accepted one of Alina's letters, written on military stationery dated August 1944, just 3 weeks before her final mission. Alina's handwriting was precise, confident, marked by the attention to detail that had made her an exceptional pilot. "Dear family," the letter began, "today I flew escort for a formation of B-17s heading to Germany. The bomber crews are so young, many of them barely old enough to vote, but they climb into those aircraft knowing they might not return. My job is to make sure as many of them come home as possible." Morrison continued reading Alina's description of aerial combat, her matter-of-fact tone concealing the extraordinary danger she faced during every mission. But it was the letter's conclusion that made his throat tighten with emotion. "I know this war won't last forever," Alina had written. "Someday I'll come home and we'll all sit around the family table again, sharing stories and planning for the future. But if something happens to me over here, I want you to know that every mission I fly is worth it. The freedom you'll enjoy after this war ends, that's what makes everything we're doing worthwhile." Elizabeth studied Morrison's face as he absorbed Alina's words. "She never came home for that family dinner, Major. But reading her letters over the years, I began to understand that she had found something in military aviation that fulfilled her completely." Morrison looked up from the letter toward the flight line, where young pilots were preparing for training sorties that would prepare them for the same kind of challenges Alina had faced over European skis. "Your great-aunt found her calling, Ms. Williams. She found a way to serve something larger than herself." "Tell me about your encounter with her," Elizabeth said quietly. "Tell me how she completed her final mission." Morrison spent the next hour describing his flight with Alina, choosing his words carefully to honor both the supernatural aspects of their meeting and the profound impact it had on his understanding of military service. Elizabeth listened without interruption, occasionally touching the letters in her lap as if drawing strength from Alina's preserved words. "She was exactly as I imagined her," Elizabeth said when Morrison finished his account. Competent, confident, focused on the mission rather than personal glory. The family always said Alina was born to fly. Morrison nodded, remembering Alina's natural command of her P-51 Mustang despite the impossible circumstances of her appearance in 2025. She was a pilot in the truest sense, someone whose entire being was oriented toward flight and service. Elizabeth opened another section of her satchel, revealing Alina's personal flight logbook, a leather-bound record of every hour she had flown from her initial training through her final mission. The pages showed meticulous record-keeping that documented Alina's evolution from student pilot to combat veteran. 37 missions, Elizabeth said, running her finger down columns of dates, aircraft numbers, and mission types. But look at this. The final entry is dated September 16, 2025, the day after your encounter with her over Alaska. Morrison stared at the impossible entry, written in Alina's precise handwriting despite the fact that her physical form had dissolved nearly 3 years earlier. The logbook showed Alina's 38th and final mission, formation flight with F-22 pilots. Mission complete. All aircraft returned safely. "How is this possible?" Morrison whispered. Elizabeth smiled, her expression carrying Alina's determination translated across generations. "Major, I think some aspects of military service exist outside the normal rules of time and space. Alina's mission wasn't complete until she had passed her wisdom to the next generation of military pilots." Morrison realized that Alina's appearance over Alaska had been carefully planned, not by military commanders or supernatural forces, but by Alina herself. She had somehow arranged her return to ensure that her example would inspire future aviators, that her sacrifice would have meaning beyond her individual service. "Ms. Williams, there's something I want to show you." Morrison led Elizabeth to the squadron briefing room, where Alina's photograph held the place of honor among portraits of legendary military aviators. Below her picture, a brass plaque bore the inscription that Morrison had personally commissioned. "Lieutenant Alina, Valkyrie, Marchetti proved that courage transcends time itself." Elizabeth touched the plaque gently, tears streaming down her cheeks. She would have been embarrassed by the recognition, but she would have appreciated that her example was helping other pilots. "Your great aunt's influence extends far beyond this single plaque," Morrison said. "Every pilot who graduates from our training program carries Alina's example with them. Her understanding of courage, service, and the bonds between warriors that becomes part of their approach to military aviation." Morrison showed Elizabeth through the training facilities, explaining how Alina's story was woven throughout the curriculum that prepared modern fighter pilots for the challenges they would face. Elizabeth watched young aviators practicing formation flying, learning tactical maneuvers, and studying the historical context that gave their service deeper meaning. "They're continuing Alina's mission," Elizabeth said, observing a group of pilots debriefing their training flight with the intense focus that marked all serious aviators. "Yes, they are. And someday, when these pilots become squadron commanders and training officers themselves, they'll pass Alina's example to the next generation. Her mission truly is eternal." As their visit concluded, Elizabeth presented Morrison with a final gift from Alina's personal effects, her aviator sunglasses, preserved in their original case since 1944. The glasses showed the wear patterns of a pilot who had flown 37 combat missions, their lenses scratched by wind and sand, and the relentless demands of military service. "Alina would want these to continue serving," Elizabeth said. "Maybe you could display them where young pilots will see them and remember that excellence in aviation isn't about the technology you're flying. It's about the character you bring to the mission." Morrison accepted the sunglasses with appropriate reverence, understanding that he was receiving a sacred trust. Alina's personal gear would become another tangible connection between past and future, another way to ensure that her example remained vivid for pilots who would face their own tests of courage and commitment. 10 years after his encounter with Alina Marchetti, Colonel Kyle Morrison stood before the largest gathering of military pilots in Air Force history. The annual Fighter Pilot Symposium had invited him as the keynote speaker, recognizing his contributions to pilot training and his unique perspective on the historical continuity of military aviation. Morrison looked out at an audience of 1,500 aviators, active duty personnel, reservists, National Guard pilots, and veterans whose service spanned 6 decades of military aviation. These pilots flew everything from F-35 Lightning IIs to vintage warbirds, but they shared the fundamental characteristics that defined all who chose the warrior's path. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying across the auditorium without amplification, "I want to tell you about a pilot who changed my understanding of what it means to wear wings in service of something greater than ourselves." Morrison displayed Alina's photograph on the massive screen behind the podium, her 1944 portrait showing the determination that had carried her through 37 combat missions. The audience fell silent, recognizing something profound in Alina's gaze that transcended the decades between her service and theirs. Lieutenant Alina Valkyrie Marchetti disappeared over the North Sea in September 1944 while protecting Allied bombers from enemy attack. She was 23 years old, a veteran of 37 combat missions, and one of 38 women who died serving as military pilots during World War II. Morrison paused, studying the faces of his audience. These modern aviators represented the culmination of 8 decades of aviation evolution, but they faced the same fundamental challenges Alina had confronted: the need to make split-second decisions under pressure, the responsibility to protect others, the weight of serving ideals larger than personal survival. Alina's story would have ended there, filed away in classified archives and forgotten by everyone except her family. But 10 years ago, she returned to complete her final mission. Morrison described his encounter with Alina over Alaska, presenting it as a masterclass in the continuity of military service, rather than focusing on its supernatural aspects. The audience absorbed every detail, understanding instinctively that they were receiving wisdom that transcended ordinary professional development. What Alina taught me, what she taught everyone who witnessed her return, is that military aviation creates bonds that exist outside normal limitations. When you strap on wings in defense of freedom, you join a conversation that includes every pilot who ever faced enemy fire with nothing but skill, courage, and commitment to mission success. A hand rose in the audience. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Saber Santos, one of the Air Force's most decorated female fighter pilots. "Sir, what was Alina's most important message for modern military aviators?" Morrison smiled, feeling Alina's presence like an invisible co-pilot guiding his response. "That the mission is bigger than individual recognition, Saber. Alina proved that warriors serve not for medals or official acknowledgement, but because freedom demands defenders in every generation." Morrison continued his presentation by describing the Valkyrie flight training program, explaining how Alina's example had been incorporated into modern pilot education. Statistical analysis showed that graduates of the program demonstrated superior performance across every measurable category, but Morrison knew the real impact couldn't be captured in numbers. "Alina's influence extends far beyond training statistics," Morrison explained. "She proved that excellence in military aviation isn't about the technology you're flying, it's about the character you bring to the mission." Her P-51 Mustang was state-of-the-art for 1944, but primitive compared to your current aircraft. The difference between her success and failure was Alina herself. The audience responded with sustained applause, recognizing truth that resonated with their own experiences. Every pilot in that auditorium had faced moments when technology failed, when training proved inadequate, when success depended entirely on individual character and determination. Morrison concluded his presentation with Alina's final message, the wisdom she had shared during their impossible flight together over Alaska's endless sky. Alina told me that courage isn't about individual heroics. Courage is about maintaining faith with everyone who wore these wings before us, and everyone who will wear them after we're gone. It's about understanding that when you climb into your cockpit, you're continuing a mission that started before you were born and will continue long after you're gone. The standing ovation lasted for 7 minutes, but Morrison barely heard it. He was remembering Alina's voice, her laughter, the way sunlight had seemed to bend around her silver P-51 Mustang as it dissolved back into whatever realm had preserved her for 8 decades. After the symposium, Morrison was approached by dozens of pilots wanting to learn more about Alina's story and the training program that bore her name. Young aviators, seasoned veterans, and everyone in between recognized something essential in Alina's example that spoke to their own understanding of military service. But it was a conversation with a senior Air Force general that would define the next phase of Morrison's career and Alina's continuing influence on military aviation. General Patricia "Thunder" Williams, no relation to Alina's family, commanded Air Education and Training Command, making her responsible for developing the Air Force's pilot training curriculum. She had watched Morrison's presentation with the analytical mind that had earned her 4 stars and the respect of everyone in military aviation. "Colonel Morrison," General Williams said after most of the crowd had dispersed, "I want to discuss expanding your Valkyrie program throughout Air Education and Training Command. What you've developed at Elmendorf represents a fundamental breakthrough in how we prepare pilots for military service." Morrison felt Alina's presence like a gentle wind, her determination flowing through him as he considered the implications of the general's proposal. "Ma'am, Alina's example could certainly benefit pilot training throughout the Air Force, but the program's effectiveness depends on understanding that military service creates bonds that transcend individual careers." "Explain that." Morrison chose his words carefully, knowing that Alina's story would reach its full potential only if he could communicate its deeper meaning to senior military leadership. "General, the Valkyrie program works because it teaches young pilots that they're part of a continuum that extends far beyond their individual service. Alina proved that the bonds between warriors exist outside normal limitations of time, space, and even death itself." General Williams nodded, her expression showing the thoughtful consideration that marked all successful senior commanders. "You're saying that historical education creates stronger military pilots." "I'm saying that understanding their place in military aviation's broader story gives pilots deeper motivation than mere professional competence. When they understand that their service connects them to Alina Marchetti and every other pilot who chose to risk everything in defense of freedom, their performance reflects that higher purpose." The conversation continued for another hour, with General Williams probing the philosophical foundations that made Morrison's training program so effective. By its conclusion, she had authorized expansion of the Valkyrie program to 3 additional Air Force bases, with plans for service-wide implementation pending the results of a comprehensive evaluation. Morrison accepted the assignment with appropriate military bearing, but his thoughts were focused on Alina and the responsibility she had entrusted to him. Her example was about to influence thousands of young pilots, ensuring that her understanding of courage and service would shape military aviation for generations to come. That evening, Morrison stood on Elmendorf's flight line, watching F-22 Raptors return from training sorties under Alaska's aurora-painted sky. The same stars that had guided Alina's navigation during 37 combat missions over Europe now illuminated aircraft that represented 8 decades of aviation evolution since her final flight. Morrison keyed his radio to the frequency Alina had used during their impossible encounter 10 years earlier. Static filled the airwaves for several minutes before he spoke into the darkness. Valkyrie 77, this is Phantom 11. Your mission is expanding beyond our wildest expectations. The bonds you proved between warriors are about to influence military aviation throughout the Air Force. The static continued for 30 seconds before fading into silence, but Morrison felt Alina's acknowledgement in the way the aurora shifted overhead, painting new patterns that seemed to incorporate both past and future into a single, magnificent display of light and purpose. Alina's influence was about to reach its full potential, ensuring that her understanding of courage, service, and the eternal bonds between warriors would guide military aviation into an uncertain but hopeful future. 15 years after Colonel Morrison's encounter with Alina Marchetti, the Valkyrie flight training program had become the standard curriculum for all Air Force pilot training. Young aviators throughout the service learned Alina's story as part of their fundamental military education, understanding that their service connected them to warriors across generations. Morrison, now promoted to Brigadier General, commanded the Air Force's pilot training enterprise, overseeing the development of aviators who would carry military aviation into the second half of the 21st century. His office walls displayed photographs of legendary pilots from every era of flight, but Alina's portrait held the central position, a constant reminder of the supernatural encounter that had changed his understanding of military service. The impact of Alina's example extended far beyond individual pilot training. Military aviation units throughout the world had begun incorporating historical education into their professional development, recognizing that understanding the past strengthened performance in the present. Alina's story had become required reading at staff colleges, war colleges, and professional military education programs across all service branches. But it was a letter from a young lieutenant that reminded Morrison of the program's most important impact, its influence on individual pilots who carried Alina's example into their daily military service. General Morrison, the letter began, I graduated from the Valkyrie program 6 months ago and am now flying F-35s in support of overseas operations. Yesterday, during a particularly challenging mission, I found myself thinking about Alina Marchetti and the 37 combat missions she flew over Europe. The letter continued with a description of a tactical situation that had required split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. The young pilot, Lieutenant Jessica Comet Kim, had successfully completed her mission while ensuring the safety of her wingman and the ground forces they were supporting. When the moment came to choose between personal safety and mission success, Kim wrote, I remembered Alina's example. I remembered that she had faced similar choices 37 times, and that her decision to put mission accomplishment above personal survival had saved 21 Allied crew members during her final flight. Morrison read the letter twice, understanding that Alina's influence had reached exactly where she had intended it, into the cockpits of young pilots facing the same fundamental challenges she had confronted over European skis 8 decades earlier. Kim's letter was one of hundreds Morrison received each year from pilots whose service had been shaped by Alina's example. These aviators flew different aircraft, faced different threats, and operated in different tactical environments, but they all understood the continuity of military service that connected them to Alina's generation of warriors. Morrison's staff had compiled these letters into a collection that demonstrated the program's impact on individual pilot development. The testimonials revealed common themes: increased confidence under pressure, stronger commitment to mission accomplishment, and deeper understanding of military aviation's historical significance. Alina's story taught me that courage isn't about fearlessness. wrote Major Robert Viper Jackson, a seasoned F-22 pilot. Courage is about doing your job despite the fear, because the mission matters more than personal comfort. Before learning about Alina Marchetti, reported Captain Lisa Phoenix Rodriguez, I thought military aviation was just a career field. Now I understand that I'm part of something much larger, a tradition of warriors who chose to risk everything in defense of freedom. These testimonials confirmed what Morrison had suspected since his encounter with Alina over Alaska. Her return had been carefully orchestrated to ensure maximum impact on future generations of military pilots. She had somehow arranged to appear at precisely the right moment, to exactly the right person, in circumstances that would guarantee her example would be preserved and transmitted. Morrison was reviewing another batch of letters when his aide announced an unexpected visitor. Elizabeth Marchetti Williams had returned to Elmendorf Air Force Base, now representing a foundation she had established to preserve the stories of World War II female military aviators. "General Morrison," Elizabeth said as she entered his office, "I wanted to thank you personally for ensuring that Alina's example continues to influence military aviation. The Foundation has been contacted by hundreds of military pilots who learned about Alina through your training program." Morrison rose to greet Elizabeth, nodding that she carried the same leather satchel that had contained Alina's personal effects during her previous visit. "Ms. Williams, your great aunt's influence extends far beyond what either of us could have imagined 15 years ago." Elizabeth opened her satchel, revealing new documents that had been discovered in recently declassified military archives. These files contained additional information about Alina's service, including mission reports that provided greater detail about her extraordinary performance during 37 combat sorties. The Foundation's research has uncovered evidence that,